You might remember this, it's the Sony FH7 Mk2, a mid-80s luggable stereo radio cassette mini system. Since I last featured this in a video, I've acquired some now quite rare components that expanded its capabilities, and I'd like to show those to you today. I've previously demonstrated this with its optional Sony PSQ7 record player that stacks neatly on the top. One interesting quirk about this fully automatic turntable, beyond the fact that the record hangs out over the side, is that the only user controls are power and start and stop. There's no way to lift and cue the arm on the record. Now, you could, at a pinch, do this manually, but I really wouldn't recommend it, which means that this is a record player that encourages you to listen through the whole side of a record in one go. If you want to hear the last track on side A, you'll need to first listen to whatever tracks precede it, which I really don't mind, but I thought it's something that was worth mentioning. Now, as far as that luggable aspect goes, the whole thing connects together and locks in place once the handle is attached on the top. This then enables you to transport the device around as a rather bulky and heavy portable stereo radio cassette, but since it doesn't run off batteries, you're restricted to always keeping it within reach of a power socket, but more on that later. First, I'd like to show you another optional accessory. This is the Sony EBP-78 a compact CD player that was styled to fit in perfectly with the rest of this system. It's a top loader, and whilst it is a standalone device that isn't restricted to just being used with these FH7 systems, its dimensions and its styling show that this is exactly where it belongs. It really finishes the system off. When this compact display came out, the vast majority of people hadn't bought into CDs yet. A setup like this would have really been quite desirable. This is exactly the kind of thing that people would pay a special visit to your house just to take a look at. Heck, it's so smart, I think it's still worth showing it off all these decades later. The date of launch of this CD player could be narrowed down with the help of this magazine. In their September 1985 issue, they've got a write-up of the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago. At this show, Sony introduced 4 new CD players, one of which was this model. This brought the total number of Sony CD players at this time to 9, so it's still quite early days for the format. One of these models in the Sony range was their first portable CD player, the D5, and that cost $300, which was the same as this new EBP-78. These 2 CD players were the cheapest models in Sony's range, but with inflation, that's still almost $850 nowadays. But for a budget model, it really does have some premium touches about it. For example, I really do appreciate the completely unnecessary illuminated compact disc logo. It just adds something to it. In fact, the overall look of this exudes a quality and a level of finish that was lacking from some of the later models. Of course, being an early machine, we're still in the era of plastering the word digital on it in that futuristic retro 80s font, and not just on the front panel, but on the top as well. I also appreciate nice touches like the LEDs behind the play and pause buttons, and there's also another LED that gets activated whenever a playback sequence program has been entered into the system. It's a simple device. It's only capable of showing the remaining time for the disc, for example, rather than the current track, but it does display a totally unnecessary but appreciated red scan whenever the tracks are being skipped through. Whilst it doesn't have a remote control itself, if the control sockets on the rear were attached up to an appropriate device, it could be operated through a remote connected to that. Notice, though, that the outputs here are just line level. There's no digital out on this, as you'd expect for the time. Looking at the back of the FH7 system, though, there's only one input, and that is a phono level for the turntable. The CD/auxiliary input is on the front panel to the left of the graphic equalizer, which necessitates a little bit of clumsy exposed wiring. That's not the only issue, though, as the phono and auxiliary inputs share a single button on the source selector. The front input takes priority on this, so it needs to be unplugged if you want to listen to that record player. So yeah, not exactly ideal, but still, I definitely would not have complained about the need to unplug a wire if this had been my system in 1986. But now we need to unplug a lot more than just the one wire, as I'd like to show you the other accessory I've got for the FH7, and this one is incredibly difficult to find nowadays. We're going to swap out the AC-78 power supply, which is also the part that connects up to the speakers, and we're going to replace this with the EBP-78 power supply. Now, this is the one for the FH7 Mk3, but it'll work just fine with my Mk2, the main difference being the text on the front. Talking about the front, the first noticeable difference you'll spot here is that this has a 12-volt power supply input. That would allow you to connect it up to an adapter and power it from the lighter socket of your car. But the main change is to be found around the back. Whereas the previous one had an AC power lead coming out of it, this one just has a drawer for holding batteries, 12 D cells. And how long can this be powered by those batteries? Well, according to the instructions, which use a metric of recording continuously from the radio, that could be done for 5 hours with regular batteries or 11 with alkalines. I suspect that that number, though, could vary quite considerably depending upon how loud you had the speaker volume turned up. Now, the instructions do show the right order in which to stack the components, so while I'm following this and putting it back together again, I'll mention that I do feel very fortunate to have a complete set of all the components as well as the connecting hardware. Because when you've got this thing set up separately on the counter like I had it before, you've got some parts that you need to store carefully. There's metal brackets that go on either side, there's bolts that go into those with little plastic washers on them, and the potential for that stuff going missing over the last few decades is very high. So fortunately, I've got everything I need to put this back together again, including the handle that goes on the top. Now, when it's being run from the DC power supply, the overall power output is reduced compared to when it's on AC. It won't go as loud, but it'll still go more than loud enough for most people, including myself. On AC power, I rarely put the volume on this more than 25% of the way up. Another issue here is the lack of cable storage. Rather than having the speaker wires dangling, I'm going to swap them out for some shorter ones to keep things neater. Okay, it's time to give it a go. This bookshelf mini system has now been transformed into a battery-powered stereo radio cassette boombox. Now, you might have noticed it's looking a little bit subdued. That's because there are 4 battery-saving measures going on here. Can you spot what they are? The first one is the backlight of the digital radio display. It isn't lit up now. The same thing goes for the peak power level meter. That doesn't work now. We've also lost the directional indicators for the cassette player. And finally, and most heinously, the little red LEDs in the graphic equalizer have also been extinguished. Here's a quick reminder of what it looked like before. Okay, so now it might look a little bit more sombre, but of course we do gain an ability to use it away from a plug socket, and more likely than not you wouldn't be able to see those lights if you had this outside anyway. It's important to stress, though, that what we have here is a bookshelf hi-fi, a microsystem that's running on batteries, and as a result there are some significant pros and cons when you compare this to a regular purpose-built boombox. The first one is the sound quality. I own a good number of boomboxes, some of them considered to be amongst the best made, but the sound quality on the Sony is leagues above all of them. It's no wonder, though, because we're comparing apples and oranges. Boombox are intended first and foremost to be easily carried around. That was clearly near the bottom of the list when the Sony FH7 was being designed. It's a mini system with a handle. Just look at the depth of those speakers compared to this very traditionally styled Hitachi boombox. That bulk means that the Sony is inconvenient to carry, but the payoff is a vastly improved sound quality. And that Hitachi, fully loaded up with 9 D cells, weighs 6.53 kilograms. The Sony, well, that's 13.43. That's more than double. You can perhaps now see why the optional DC power supplies are difficult to find. Very few people wanted to carry around their precious FH7 mini system outside the house. It made a lot more sense just to keep it inside and buy a separate purpose-built boombox instead. Leaving the DC power supply in place is also a bit of a limitation when it comes to using this in the house, because even if you plug in a 12-volt DC adapter, you still lose that illumination, as well as a bit of the volume. So I think it's time that I swap that AC power supply back in. I decided to time myself to see how long it took me to swap from one power supply to the other. I managed to do it in 5.5 minutes, but I'm sure I could have shaved perhaps a minute or more off that if I hadn't had so much trouble getting the speaker wires to fit into the fiddly spring clip terminals, or getting the handle to latch securely in place. But now that it's all back together, let's weigh it up again, because I think that AC adapter felt heavier than the one with the batteries in it. But is it? Well, the answer is yes. The battery pack was over 1 kilogram lighter than the AC power supply. So whichever way you look at it, this is a heavy portable. But still, it's around 3.5 kilograms lighter than that Sharp VZ2000 I showed a while ago, but that thing is crazy. So in summary, whilst it's not its forte, the FH7 can function as a very high quality boombox. But really, it's better off in the house as a luggable stereo system, one on which you could space out the speakers to make a nice little bookshelf hi-fi, and if you wanted to, you could expand it by adding in a record player, which made it into a compact home stereo system that was capable of playing all your analogue media. But then when you were ready to embrace the digital future, you could splash out on the matching CD player and you'd have a system that could play any and all of the music formats that were on sale in your local record shop. So I hope you've enjoyed having a look at this lovely little 1980s time capsule. But that's it for the moment. As always, thanks for watching.